talking of retirement, I won't wear a jacket, so it's to make a point that I'm no longer bound by civil service formality. I mean, I'm certainly touched by what was said about my career. If I think of it as lifetime, strictly speaking, I came to development late. As Tom Arnold will know, I was abruptly translated into it from a posting in Moscow, and indeed my first and most memorable experience was accompanying Tom and others on a visit to Ethiopia as my first induction into the challenges of development. I never looked back. It was one of the most enriching experiences of my life. I don't mean just the trip to Ethiopia, but the 4 years in which I served as Director General of Irish Aid. First of all, one of the things I'm proudest of is that during those 4 years we managed to put cooperation with our civil society partners in Ireland on a proper footing for the first time. That was a reflection of something which was obvious, that if you like, the Irish state and civil society are continuous partners in trying to do good for the poorest people in the world, the most vulnerable, the most disadvantaged. And I was pleased that, helped by admittedly an increase in our Irish Aid budget, we were able to have new multi-annual programming arrangements with the NGO partners, which continue to this day. And that was my first direct realization of the role which civil society plays both here in Ireland and internationally in support of development and humanitarian objectives. I brought that experience and commitment with me to my posting to the United Nations. There I ended up, don't ask me how, but I ended up being twinned with Kenya, as Sharon said, for the Sustainable Development Goals negotiations. And it is true that I made a contribution to ensuring that civil society were fully engaged in those negotiations. In fact, and I'm not taking credit for this, but with my Kenyan colleague, we managed to create a set of arrangements which are described as the high point in terms of civil society involvement so far in UN negotiations. It's debatable how we managed to achieve that. I mean, for those of you who aren't familiar with the UN, the problem is usually that certain major developing countries are deeply suspicious of civil society involvement in UN negotiations and go to great lengths to ensure that NGOs that their involvement is kept to a minimum, and ideally that they are removed from the room before the final stage of the negotiations is reached. Somehow my Kenyan colleague and I managed to distract the attention of the major developing countries with a number of perhaps well-timed controversies, which meant that in the final few weeks of the negotiations, NGOs were present. I should say that they were present from the beginning of the negotiations in the form of weekly structured dialogues between the member states who were negotiating and various civil society groupings. That was the first. It sounds obvious, it sounds natural that there should be something like that, but it hadn't usually happened in the UN. So what it meant was that we brought down the NGO representatives from the gallery, literally, placed them in the body of the room, and we had dialogue in which NGOs and government delegates sat side by side and exchanged views about what the SDGs should contain and the accompanying package. It was slightly stilted at the beginning, I'll admit that, but my colleague and I tried to provoke, tried to challenge, tried to get a real debate going, and gradually the reservations began to ebb away. So we honestly felt that we all benefited a lot, and we got the direct input of NGOs. As one rather perhaps trivial example, but it's one that I will remember for a long time, the NGOs are divided into major groups at the UN. That's literally capital M, capital G, and there's a major group for children and youth. So one 18-year-old stood up at a certain stage in one of these sessions and said that the document would need to reflect the capacity for I've almost forgotten now, the capacity for infinite activism on the part of young people in support of a better society. And my colleague and I looked at each other and more or less mentally made a note of that, and since I was doing all the drafting, I then stuck it in, and we've had, we got a fantastic international response to that, because young people everywhere saw the potential of the agenda for themselves, and they liked the phrase about infinite activism. And so that's perhaps a trivial thing where I was unlikely to have much resistance, but nevertheless, that's where NGO views got directly into the document. Perhaps more importantly, Sharon mentioned at the end, leaving nobody behind. That phrase, I admit I put it in, but that phrase came to us from a leading NGO in one of the many written submissions we were given during the negotiations. And I put it in along with the accompanying phrase that we will reach the furthest behind first. So that's perhaps a more serious example of where constant NGO advocacy will pay off, because it's no exaggeration to say that leaving nobody behind is seen now as the absolute measurement of the success or otherwise of the SDGs. We must leave nobody behind, but so it's become the motto for the SDGs, and I have a particular NGO to thank for that. It helped that I was sympathetic, Ireland is sympathetic. It would be natural for Ireland to respond sympathetically to what civil society proposed, but nevertheless it was an NGO which came up with the concept. And so there are many such examples. For me, the proudest moment was that when the document was finally gathered through, that the NGOs were in the room, that we had managed to keep them there, even though the developing countries wanted to get rid of them. And that meant that, I speak as if they're a third party, but obviously you are all civil society. Civil society was present at the birth of the SDGs directly. It meant that they couldn't feel that somehow this had been negotiated by governments behind the scenes, and it meant that from the word go, civil society were fully signed up to the document. And I should say that in the final few days they were able to meet, even during the all-night sessions, they were able to meet delegates and keep up the pressure to have the most ambitious possible set of goals at the end of the day. And I think we came out with a highly ambitious set of goals for the world for the next 15 years, and that is down to constant constructive NGO advocacy. So a huge debt really is owed to civil society internationally, but also in this room, for the constant support, and not just support, but constructive sort of co-building of the goals. And now we, as Sharon mentioned, there is we're into the implementation phase. Civil society have an absolutely vital role to play, both here and internationally, in ensuring that the goals are met. They can't just simply remain as a pretty picture on the wall, which we pay respect to from time to time. They have to mean something real for governments all over the world, for each of the 193 governments who signed they didn't literally sign the document, but who adopted the document. That means that in the phase where each country is preparing its national report and how it's doing, civil society must be fully involved. I have absolutely no doubt that will happen here over the coming months. I think in Ireland there's no problem in that respect, but in many other countries, civil society would have to work a bit harder to get involved. And indeed, in some countries, civil society would probably be the only form of pressure we have to ensure that that government honours what it said it would do. The goals were adopted without reservation by every country in the world. So this is the most formal commitment it could have made. nobody yet is residing from those commitments, but should they reside from them, we need civil society to be actively involved in every country in order to keep pressure on, and also to play a more, if you like, a more technical role. That is, data have to be collated, assembled, statistical capacity has to be increased. Civil society, in the broadest sense, has a role to play in ensuring that every country can make its contribution to the vast amount of data needed to establish that we are all that we are on target. So that's all I wanted to say. During the subsequent negotiations on the New York Declaration, I worked hard to get civil society involved there also. I should say that that was more difficult because at the UN there was this general sense on the part of the more skeptical developing countries that it's okay to have civil society involved for a major development negotiation, but when it comes to strict UN business, as they would see it, civil society should stay outside the door. Therefore, in the migration and refugee negotiation, the same countries, I can't name them, but the same countries who had been willing to be more flexible for the SDGs decided that they didn't want civil society involvement on migration and refugee issues. Therefore, it was a little bit more awkward there. But I managed to have a constant round of meetings myself with the NGOs relevant there. And since I was doing all the drafting, that helped again in the document which we managed to agree. So I really warmly thank Dochas for the honour which was given to me. I don't deserve it, but it is humbling, and I'm very moved by it, and I look forward to working in making any contribution I can to the success and the effectiveness of Dochas and the entire civil society sector in Ireland. Thank you very much.